Everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content, and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and today we're going to have another episode of my board game collection, Shelf by Shelf. And today I'm going to be covering my fifth shelf, shelf number 5, and that is this shelf right here. And this is my Uwe Rosenberg big box shelf. All his big box games. Here I have some meeple pieces in a baggie from one of his games. So the first game you see visible right here is Glass Road. Glass Road is a really cool game where you have a little bit of, Uwe Rosenberg's, typical spiel. You've got some resource management. You got a resource wheel that you have to manipulate and rotate, which he's implemented in lots of different games. You're trying to acquire different buildings that give you victory points, but they also give you different abilities and ways to produce all sorts of goods. Again, very typical Uwe Rosenberg board game mechanisms. However, what you do have in this game that he doesn't have in many of his games is you have a variable phase order phase in the beginning of each turn. You have a group of 15 cards with 15 different characters, and at the beginning of each of the 4 rounds, it's a short game, it's only 4 rounds, at the beginning of each of those rounds, you're selecting 5 of those 15 characters privately, and all the other players are doing the same. And then you're going to take turns one by one selecting the 3 of these 5 characters that you've picked to actually execute their actions. And once you play a card down, if you are the only player that selected that character in your hand of 5, you get to execute 2 of its actions, and nobody else gets to do anything else with that character. However, if somebody else also picked a character that you picked, they get to play it down at that moment, and they can piggyback off that action. But now you and that other player, or other players who selected the same character, can only execute 1 out of those 2 actions. So you want to ideally choose 3 out of those 5 cards that nobody else selected, but you want the other 2 out of the 5 cards to be cards that someone else selected, in order to capitalize and get as many actions as possible during those turns. Really cool, really neat game, and it's pretty short for how meaty and substantial it feels. What else do we have here? To its side, actually, right here, you have Agricola. All creatures big and small. The 2-player implementation of Agricola. It is the big box edition here, which has 2 expansions, which includes tons of different buildings for different setup variability. Here, 2 players. It's a worker placement game. 2 players are placing one of their 3 meeples, which represent their family and what have you, on different spots of the board that trigger different abilities, give you different resources, allow you to acquire different animals and build different buildings. And basically this game zeroes in on the animal husbandry of Agricola. There is no vegetables, there is no family growing, there's no feeding of your people. It's Agricola without lots of the stress. It's definitely a lighter experience and a much shorter experience. Agricola, all creatures big and small. And behind Glass Road right here, we have Aura and Labora, and this is probably the heaviest of Uwe Rosenberg's games, or at least the games that I have here on this shelf, number 5. This is another worker placement game. Again, you have resource management. Again, you have a resource wheel, kind of like Glass Road, except it's implemented differently in this game. And again, you have to manipulate that wheel, because that wheel determines how valuable certain goods are in the particular round that you're in. You're building buildings. The different buildings not only produce different goods for you, exchange different resources. There's lots of resource conversion going on in this game, but they also give you different victory points based on how valuable those buildings are, based on other buildings that might be adjacent to that building, or that might also be in other parts of your player board. You're also expanding your player area, because you start with a main player board that's relatively decent, has a few spots for some buildings, but as the game progresses, you're expanding westward, eastward, northward, southward. You're adding different terrain types that can accommodate specific type of buildings. And all the while, it's a worker placement game with 3 workers. They're all monks. One in particular is your prior, and he's a little bit more powerful because you can place him as soon as you build a building and execute its action. You don't have to wait for the future. And also just, it has a really neat feature where you can pay your opponent to use one of their workers that are still available to activate one of their buildings. Really cool, really neat. Again, heavy game, long game for 2 players. It's quite the opposite of Glass Road, which is actually a short experience only at 2 players. Aura and Labora. And back here we have the rest of my big box Uwe Rosenberg games. At the bottom here, you see at the Gates of Liyue. And at the Gates of Liyue, in my opinion, perhaps has the best solo variant of all of Uwe Rosenberg's big box games. I adore the solo variant, but it is still fun as a two-player game. Basically, players are merchants in ancient or medieval China, and you're trying to gain the favor of different customers. Some are regular customers, some are casual customers, and you're trying to meet their demands. They're all trying to buy certain veggies from you, and that's basically what you're doing. You're planting veggies, you're growing them, you're reaping them, and you're converting them and trying to maximize them as much as possible so that you can have enough to especially meet the demands of your regular customers. Because if you ever leave a regular customer of yours unsatisfied 2 turns in a row, then you got to pay a penalty, and that costs money, which at the end of the day is points. But your casual customers, there's less of a commitment, there's less pressure. They will give you more money at the end of the day, but they're only going to buy from you once, so there's no guarantee, there's no loyalty. There's a bunch of other different things that's going on, different cards that you're drafting that give you special abilities, some characters, some additional stalls that allow you to trade resources with yourself. Really cool game at the Gates of Liyue. Then above it we have Le Havre, and this is another one of his heavier games. This game here, players are running the port. They're trying to grow their part of Le Havre by acquiring resources and gold and money in order to build buildings or buy buildings straight up. And these buildings give you lots of different abilities, but the bread and butter, just like at Labora, is resource conversion. You're acquiring resources and you're converting them for different resources, or you're upgrading them to superior versions of themselves. So clay turns into brick, and grain turns into bread, and cows turn into meat. And again, like lots of other Uwe Rosenberg games, at the end of certain rounds, there's a harvest, and you need to feed your people. You need to feed your workers. And as the rounds progress, it increases and intensifies the amount of food you need to provide. So there is that pressure. But this game is so generous. You only have one worker, but there's so much that one worker can do when placed in the right buildings, right? Fun game. You feel very wealthy and very prosperous by the end of it, Le Havre. And then you have Agricola, and this is probably his most renowned game of all, the first of his big box experiences. Ever since then, he's never stopped. I mentioned Agricola, all creatures being small. I do prefer the bigger game experience, because not only do you have a longer game, not only do you have the tight tension of feeding your family and trying to optimize all these different areas and aspects of farming, not only just animal husbandry, like in Agricola, all creatures big and small, but also planting and harvesting of crops, and also just the growth of your family in order to have more people to work the farm and optimize your actions with your worker placement. But also, this game has a card draft before the game begins of 2 different sets of cards. You have your minor improvements and you have your occupations. And these cards are so cool because they combo well with one another and allow you to more efficiently execute your worker placement and grow your crops and basically they improve all your actions. But you kind of need to set your strategy from the beginning of the game and know which cards complement one another, work well with one another, and also know that while you're drafting maybe 14 cards at the beginning of the game, you might be lucky to get to actually have played 5 of them. And as the game progresses, you got to decide which ones you will stick with. And finally, on the top here, we have Mercator. And Mercator is a wonderful pickup and delivery game, which also includes a little bit of resource conversion. It includes some neat contract fulfillment, because you're trying to pick up particular resources in particular places and then take them to very particular places to score a certain amount of points. And it progressively gets more intense as far as how much you need to pick up, how much you need to deliver, but also how valuable those contracts are. And at the end of the game, those contracts are essentially your victory points. You do have a couple additional like bonus building cards, they call it, that allow you to score points in different ways, but for the most part, you're going to be scoring through those contract fulfillments. This game has some great resource management and resource conversion as well. However, my knock on this game is that the component quality is inferior. The graphic design is definitely leaves a lot to be desired. The game board is a very abstracted map of Europe instead of a more realistic depiction of Europe, which I would have preferred with more, garish artwork or coloring. That would have been cool for me, but no, it's very abstracted, very mustard colored. The resources are just basic cubes. As a matter of fact, I think there's something like 16 different resources, but there's only 8 different colored cubes. So each of the colored cubes represent 2 different resources, and based on what spot you put them on your player board, it determines where they are. So that's interesting. It adds to its fluidity as an abstract game, and it adds to its functionality and gameplay, but it does take away a little bit from the thematic purpose, because a lot of Uwe Rosenberg's games, their components are actually more adequate and representative of the actual theme, but not so much in Mercator. However, gameplay, I cannot deny, it is an amazingly phenomenal game. One of his most underrated board games, if not his most underrated board game of all time, Mercator. And that's it, folks. That was my shelf number 5, my Uwe Rosenberg big box game shelf. As you could see, I have a lot to say about those games. It's hard to cover it in few minutes, so this video took a little bit longer than some of my other board game collection shelf by shelf videos. So that's it for today's episode of shelf number 5. Thank you for joining us here When Harry Met Board Games. Comment down below. Tell me what you think about these games. Which of these games have you played? Which of these games might be on your bucket list, on your wish list? Which of these games do you totally disagree with me and wonder why the heck it's on my collection? I'm interested to read what you have to say. All right, guys. Well, this is Harry from When Harry Met Board Games saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.